was actually thinking, we're in the middle of a conference, and we're probably, a little bit past the halfway. It's interesting to see that 500 people actually made it all the way to Mountain View to talk about two topics that have not been sexy in the last few years, and now I think over time are getting sexier. So one is what's happening in Europe, and the second one is how policy making today is impacting the future of digital economy. And so it's interesting to see that a platform like this, this conference, has become the place where this kind of discussions actually take place. And we tend to mix the audience as much as possible. This is not a typical tech conference. In fact, it's not even a conference, it's a week of activities. There are probably a dozen workshops, multiple meetings. This is kind of the public face of the activities. But it's interesting to see how shaking diversity in terms of where people are coming from and what they represent is bringing interesting results. So we'll see what people think, but so far it's been I think a good experience. It's interesting. I think again, there are certain discussions that take a longer time to develop. And some of those are when they involve legislation, clearly by definition, there are long discussions. One of those is the digital single market that is being worked on at the European Commission level for quite some time now, and will take some longer time of that. But I think the perception of the impact of this legislation to the current big businesses or around here or around this museum are becoming more and more vivid, and as well as the importance for the policymakers actually to get a closer look and view and contact of what happens at the core, the heart of technology, which is Silicon Valley. So these two things together, I think, are creating more and more of a mutual interest. And so in this time around, for example, we have a much wider delegation of policymakers. They represent a significant amount of MEPs, the member of European Parliament, and also a number of local governments that made it all the way here to really get in a first look at what's happening. On the other side, I mean, the receiving party is becoming wider and wider. So it's not just the Google and the Facebook of the world, but is Microsoft, is Dell, is Ericsson, and so on and so forth. So it's interesting to see, again, as two topics that were probably not particularly sexy in the past, today have become front and center. We've been picking throughout the years, throughout the months, every year is probably 14, 15 of the top growth startups of Europe. So startups are more in the 5 to 10 million euros of revenues, 50 to 200 people, and really in hyper growth. So there's not a typical early stage startups. And so they become finally an interesting animals also for the local investors here, because those are companies that for the most part do not need money. They're profitable, they're resilient, because really if you make it in Europe, you really need to be resilient. And typically you don't grow with the typical matters and rules as here. And so they become an interesting objective and an object also for the local communities here. So we just had an investor forum this morning with 180 investors talking to this company. So that's definitely something that is more doable today than 5-6 years ago, is the fact that those companies that are already multinational by nature, even being small, the fact that all the development happens at 10,000 miles away is totally fine, as long as the product is a good fit for this market. So we're seeing more and more of that, and we're actually pretty proud to see how those companies that came from the last 2-3 years are really thriving here. One of the topics here is also try to demystify Silicon Valley. Is not all perfect. There are things that clearly are changing, and I think also a view from the old continent and support some of the matters can be helpful. So this is actually goes both ways. It's not just one way. So we talked about the diversity or the lack of diversity here, which is, as we know, a very central discussion happening today, and I think Europeans to some extent can have a good saying with that. Cybersecurity is another big deal that is really making lives of a lot of CEOs of local companies a nightmare. And again, areas where the input from European companies in general can be very helpful. So, bottom line, I think clearly this integration, can help both sides of the ocean. So, more of that.